In our last lecture, we examined Martin Luther and the contribution of the Protestant Reformation to the history of liberty. We looked at Luther as a great individual who, by his courage, by his conscience, transformed history. We saw that his belief in freedom rested in the notion of the freedom of the individual to accept the lordship of Christ and God. In that he is freed by God's grace, the individual is utterly liberated. And in that he has accepted the servitude of God, he is not only free, but the total slave of God, and can use his submission to work to the good for all mankind. It was a conception of freedom that was otherworldly. That is to say, freedom was salvation. And your task as a citizen was to accept submission to the state that had been established, ordained by God. Luther and his ideals, as we saw last time, unleashed a torrent of religious reform. We looked at Calvinism. We looked at the Anabaptist with their notion that there should be an utter separation between church and state. No coercion for religion of any kind. And by contrast, the Calvinists believed that the church and the body of believers should shape the state. And we concluded by noticing how both these currents of thought, Calvinism and the Baptist, had been transported to a new world and would shape the history of freedom in America. That new world, founded in 1492, is one of those great events that marks the beginning of the modern age. Historical divisions are important. The Middle Ages came to an end and the modern age began. And this all occurred around 1500. It is marked by earlier events such as 1453, when Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, finally fell to the Turks. Constantinople, as we saw in an earlier lecture, had been the center of the medieval world. And now, an Islamic power mastered it. And it unleashed a flood of immigrants coming first of all to Italy, bringing a knowledge of Greek, reviving the study of the classical Greek authors, and instituting the great wave of humanism, embodied in figures like Erasmus and his Greek New Testament, so important for Luther's understanding of the words of Paul. So the fall of Constantinople and the invention of printing in Germany, associated, I think rightly, with the name of Gutenberg, occurring sometime around 1450. It was printing that enabled the Reformation to spread. It meant that instead of laboriously copying works over and over again by hand, hundreds and thousands could be printed at a moment. And the printing press played an extremely important role in Luther's spread of his ideas. So printing around 1450, the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the discovery of a new world in 1492. All of these were critical elements in the emergence of a modern world. But for the historian of freedom, Lord Acton, whom we have cited before and will cite many more times, for this 19th century historian of freedom, the real beginning of the modern world was an idea in a book by Machiavelli. And that book was The Prince, one of the most influential works ever written. And we want in today's lecture to examine The Prince, its contribution to the history of liberty, as well as the concept of the divine right of kings. Both of these ideas, Machiavellianism and the divine right of kings, essentially establish the state as supreme. They are thus enemies of the idea of liberty, but again, as Lord Acton noted, we frequently learn more from the enemies of liberty than from its friends. Machiavelli's The Prince, written in 1513, is the summation of Renaissance political ideals. The Renaissance is another good age to begin the modern world with. It begins perhaps in the 14th century in the figure of Petrarch, died in 374. It was Petrarch who first embodied the concept of antiquity as an ideal to return to. In Dante, in his magnificent Divine Comedy, antiquity is still the antiquity seen through the spectacles of the Middle Ages. But Petrarch returns to the ideal of classical Rome, to the Roman city-state, to the study of Greek, to the revival of classical Latin, the Latin of Cicero. Petrarch looks upon the remains in the Forum of Rome the same way Gibbon would 400 years later, and feels sorrow that this great empire has passed away and wonders why it fell. And the Renaissance, this rebirth of classical antiquity, also saw the rebirth of the ideology of the city-state. As classical Athens and Sparta, as the classical Roman Republic were small political entities with an ideal of liberty as freedom to live under the law, with constitutions vitalized by civic virtue, that was also the ideal for the small city-states of the Renaissance in Italy. Venice, Florence, city-states which, like Rome and Athens, grew to be empires of their own. It was an age of rampant individualism, the Renaissance, in which great figures like Cesare Borgia rose by violence and intrigue, and in which openly success was the only justification. It was an age of warrior popes and of bold statesmen attempting to create personal empires for themselves. And it was the age in which the Florentine Republic reached its height. The artistic center of the world, as much as Athens had been in the 5th century BC. A cultural creativity based upon a communal conception of freedom under the law. And part of this was Niccolo Machiavelli. Born in reasonable circumstances, his father owning a small estate, citizen of the Florentine Republic, he was above all, in his productive period of life civically, a bureaucrat. Rising up through the ranks of the Florentine bureaucracy, proving himself a capable administrator, going on diplomatic missions, learning a great deal about foreign countries such as Germany, tying himself closely to one particular faction, and finding himself, when that faction lost power and the House of the Medici returned as tyrants, forced into exile. Not into exile outside of the borders of Florence, but forced to live on his small estate, for a time forbidden even to return to the city of Florence, for a time even put into jail. And there, in exile, deprived of his goal of bureaucratic power, Machiavelli turned again to the classics. He knew Latin well. He knew Greek to some extent. He was highly familiar with the lessons of classical history as he read them in Livy and in Tacitus. And he determined to write a great commentary on the first 10 books of Livy, Livy's history of the Roman Republic. But in the meantime, at a fever pitch, he wrote the principles of power as he discerned them in history and issued them in a little book, Il Principe. We translate it as the prince. It is translated perhaps better by the term the leader, as used in the same way that Mussolini would call himself Il Duce, or Hitler, der Führer. It is the leader. It is the ways to gain power and to maintain power. Machiavelli based his principles of power on the experience of history, both recent history and the past. He describes in a letter how he liked to, every evening, don his finest attire, sit down to a banquet, and entertain the great minds of the past, the great leaders of antiquity, like Scipio, like Caesar, like Septimius Severus, and engage them in a dialogue about what is power. Now, Machiavelli's book, The Prince, is a great book. That's a term that is used frequently, but I would like to define it for you. A great book is a book which, 1, deals with a great theme. 2, speaks across the ages. 3, it is written in a noble language. And 4, is a summation of the ideals of an age of history. A great theme. What theme can be more significant than power? It is power that is the leitmotif throughout history, from the pharaohs of Egypt right down into our own day. There is nothing men and women will not do to obtain power and to maintain it. That is what makes Machiavelli such a ripe subject for modern books, self-help books on how to be a good CEO, how to master people and make them do what you want. So it does speak across the ages. You can find it in your airport bookstore. Principles to Power. Remodified, but still Machiavelli. And his name is one of those few names of an author that has created a whole ideology to be Machiavellian, clever and cunning. Written in a noble language. Notice there is an A attached to that, noble language. Any language can be noble. But this means it is written in a pure, strong, powerful, memorable language. And Machiavelli chose to write in Italian, not Latin. When Dante had wanted to write about monarchy, he chose Latin, the universal language. So this would have still been common in the 16th century. But Machiavelli wrote for his own day, and he wrote in the contemporary language. It is a powerful, vigorous Italian. And it is the summation of the age of the Renaissance, of its values, of its goals, of how men and women actually behaved to achieve power. Machiavelli describes first the character of political units. If you want power in politics, you must understand the unit that you are attempting to govern. Is it a hereditary monarchy? Is it a mixed monarchy? Is it a monarchy which is partly hereditary and partly newly acquired? He looks at historical examples like why was it so easy for Alexander to govern the hereditary monarchy of the Persians once he had conquered it. So understand what it is that you wish to govern. And then understand the mechanisms by which to govern. And of course, all political power rests ultimately, Machiavelli tells us, on force, military force. And the prince, the leader, should spend all of his time involved in the study of war. He should read history to know about warfare. Whenever he's out even hunting, he should be studying the lay of the land, where a good fortress can be built. And he should know the best kind of troops, the most useful kind of troops. And they are not mercenary soldiers. They can be bought. Their captains are too easy to sway and to bribe away. That has been the failure of the Italian city-states, to put their reliance upon mercenary troops because the ordinary citizen doesn't want to serve. But the ordinary citizen must serve. The militia, the body of armed citizens trained under a militia law that makes every able-bodied male susceptible to military service, trains them under excellent captains and officers. That is where the ultimate success of a leader will lie. That will be his ultimate protection. The loyal support of a militia that is under his control and willing, even eager, to accept his rule. But you see, that's our next point. How do you get them to accept your rule? How do you make people follow you? Now, Machiavelli's book, The Prince, is written, I am convinced, as a critique of Cicero's wonderful, influential De Officiis. Published in 44 BC, after the assassination of Caesar, it was, in fact, the De Officiis, or on moral duties, Cicero's advice to his son. His son was studying in Greece. And Cicero, having retired from political affairs rather than accept the rule of Caesar, writes this book as a letter to his son on how to be a success, how to be a success in politics. There could be, in personal terms, no stronger contrast between Niccolo Machiavelli and Marcus Tullius Cicero. Machiavelli was a bureaucrat who would sell his services to a tyrant, like the Lorenzo de' Medici, if only Lorenzo de' Medici would accept them. His whole Prince is written as a means of getting de' Medici to call him back into service. He has never really served in the military. Cicero, by contrast, is a true patriot. He retires rather than accept the clemency and high office from Caesar. Cicero is a man of such bravery that after Caesar's assassination, when, as we saw, the young Octavian, become Augustus, enters the political arena and begins through violence to climb to power, Cicero will in his old age stand out and speak forth against Mark Antony and Augustus. Speak forth in the name of freedom, and then when the cause of Republican liberty is lost, willingly give his life. He is a man of moral character. Machiavelli, despite his talents and genius, he wrote a brilliant play. He was a master of the Italian language. Personally, his letters reveal a licentious and corrupt individual. Morally corrupt in the same way that Cicero is a man of integrity. And there could be no stronger contrast than between the De Officiis and Machiavelli's Prince. For the purpose of the De Officiis is to show to Cicero's son that you can be successful in politics while still being a moral individual. Cicero founds morality upon the ideal of absolute truth, absolute justice, a foundation that God cares about morality, and that ultimately no immoral act can be expedient. It may seem expedient to you. It may seem the way to success, to lie, for example, to cheat. But Cicero says ultimately it will be not only wrong, but unsuccessful. And that by acting with morality and integrity, you will achieve real, practical success. From time to time, you may be required to break your word. Give a modern example. You've promised your son a car, but he turns out to be a drunken driver. And so when the time comes for graduation, you don't give him the car. That is breaking your word, but for a moral reason. Cicero uses history, but to show how Rome's greatness has been built by men who always kept their word, always act honorably. Yes, they could have gotten rid of the military threat of the king of Epirus, Pyrrhus, by having him poisoned to death, or having him poisoned. But the Roman Senate refused to do it. It was dishonorable. And ultimately they defeated him in battle. Now, Machiavelli critiques this view. Cicero's De Officiis was one of the most often read and cited works all through the Middle Ages in advice to princes. Machiavelli critiques it. His view is that there is ultimately no such thing as an immoral act as long as it succeeds. Immorality is how people behave, and if you're going to be a success, you must just start out from that basis. And he describes the qualities of a successful leader. He must be stingy. He must be a liar. He must be cruel. He must break his word whenever it is convenient for him. That is the way to power. And Machiavelli says, I'm sorry if this offends you, but that is just how people behave. Other writers have lived as though our world is utopian. People acting the way they say they believe people should act. In fact, all our experience with people shows they are cruel, they are liars, they are deceitful. And you must act on that basis. Be stingy. People say they appreciate liberality, but in fact, if you spend too generously, all you're going to end up doing is having to tax people more and they will hate you. Cruelty. It is better to be feared than loved. Yes, if you can make people love you, it's fine. But ultimately, all they really respect is power. power and the understanding that you are going to use it. It's helpful to get fall guys, middlemen. And he describes instances in which a truly cruel ruler uses a middleman to carry out the acts of extreme viciousness, and then topples that middleman to receive the accolades of his fellow citizens. Lie. A leader, a prince, must understand that it is simply necessary to lie whenever it is useful. And people won't mind. They know you're going to lie to them. Perhaps that is the ultimate exercise in power, to lie to someone, and they know that you are lying to them, and they know that you know they are lying to them. And what about flatterers? You must avoid them. But you cannot let everybody tell you what they think. Surround yourself with good advisors. One of the first judgments that is made about a leader is the kind of advisors he has. Surround yourself with good advisors and ask them a specific question and let them tell you what they think. But never let them tell you what they think about any issue. They'll lose respect. Respect is essential, and respect is maintained through fear, and fear is maintained through the understanding that you will use power. Now, the models that Machiavelli chooses are interesting. From antiquity, he does not make much use of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. He focuses upon Septimius Severus, the emperor from 193 to 211. He devotes a long chapter to Septimius Severus. Why? Septimius Severus combines the ability of a fox and a lion. The fox who avoids the traps, and the lion who can kill the wolves. And Septimius Severus is essentially a mediocrity. Septimius Severus shows that anybody, if they apply these principles, can rise to power. Now, Machiavelli's book was so accurate, so true to life, that it was read but not celebrated. He was never recalled to Florence, even after the fall of the Medici. He was not recalled because his book, which had circulated in manuscript, was regarded as too dangerous. It was put on the list of banned books by the Pope in 1557. And Machiavellianism became a byword for evil. But in fact, Machiavelli's true heirs were not any of the princes of Italy who could not establish a unified kingdom, but rather the new monarchs. Men like Louis XI in France, men like Henry VII in England, men like Ferdinand and his wife Isabella in Spain. In fact, Ferdinand and Isabella are models for Machiavelli about how the great prince should act, carrying out actions such as not only the conquest of Granada, but acts of pious cruelty, driving out the Moors from Spain, always engaged in major activities, so men and women would admire them and celebrate them. But Ferdinand and Isabella, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Louis of France, they could not openly rest their power upon Machiavelli. Now, every state needs a myth to legitimize it. And the new monarchies, centralized bureaucracies, excellent professional armies, with a strong king unifying national areas, breaking feudal privileges, it needed a new mythology. Mythology of our own day is democracy. These new monarchies invoke the conception of the divine right of kings. They wrap themselves in the cloak of godly power. The idea that God has bestowed power upon the ruler, and the ruler is accountable to God alone. It is an idea as old as recorded history. Our first monument from Egypt is that of the king of Egypt, bashing in the heads of his foes at the behest of the gods who have chosen him. Bestowed power and victory upon Pharaoh. Early monuments from Sumer and Babylonia show the king receiving the insignia of power from the god and the laws that he will give to his country from God. And the proclamations of Egyptian pharaohs and of the kings of Babylonia proclaim that God has bestowed power upon me, and I am accountable to God. I must rule my subjects as a shepherd takes care of his sheep. It was an idea that we find in Homer, where we are told that a multitude of kings is not a good thing. There is one king to whom Zeus has bestowed the scepter. It was the ideology that supported the Empire of Rome. Augustus was portrayed as the Messiah sent by God, and on the coins of Trajan and Hadrian, we see the great god Jupiter bestowing the emblems of power, or in the case of Hadrian, the world itself, upon his chosen viceroy. Seneca, whose work De Clementia was commentated upon by Calvin, describes how Nero has been chosen out of all mankind to be the viceroy of God on earth, and is accountable only to God himself. And this conception of kingship by the grace of God was written into Roman law. We find it in the Code of Justinian at the very beginning, that God has bestowed power upon Justinian, and that these laws come through the viceroy of God himself. And then, in Paul, the powers that be are ordained of God. We have quoted this passage at length, for it establishes the essential Christian idea that all power is given by God, that earthly rulers are the viceroys of God, both good and evil, and that it is the duty of the true Christian to accept their rule. So both the study of classical antiquity, the study of the Bible, enforced in the minds of subjects their duty to obey their king. And these new monarchies, based upon this millennia-old tradition of kingship by the grace of God, the new forces that they were unleashing, the ending of feudal privileges, and a conception of royal absolutism impossible to acquire by any king of the Middle Ages. For you see, it was not only that the king was chosen by God, his power was unlimited. Now, in medieval thought, a current had developed, represented in important thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, which sought to limit royal power, which spoke of the idea that the consent of the governed was critical to any legitimate authority, and that kings were accountable for their actions to their subjects. Marsilius of Padua was the strongest proponent of this view. Secularly trained, a doctor, as well as a political thinker, his book, The Defender of the Peace, stated that kings received their power from the governed, that the consent of the governed was essential to legitimate authority. A pope, upon reading the work of Marsilius of Padua, declared it to be the most heretical work that he had ever seen. It was the idea of the divine right of kings, well, that would not only influence the monarchies of France and Spain, but in England as well, where King James I would write a book called The True Law of Free Monarchy, proclaiming that the king was absolutely free from any need to rule with the consent of the governed. So this idea of the divine right of kings was a powerful force, shaping political ideas in a new age of monarchy and in a new world. In France, the ideal of the divine right of kings, as enunciated by Bishop Bossuet, would be the focal point of Louis's dictum that the state is me. L'État c'est moi. I am everything. I am the Sun King. And even as Hadrian was chosen by Jupiter and was like the sun passing over the earth, eternal in his power, so I, Louis, chosen by God, am absolute master in all things depend upon me. This doctrine of the divine right of kings would endure in France right down to the Great Revolution, which would replace the idea of the divine right of the king by the divine right of the people, and the majority is every bit an absolute sovereign as Louis had ever been. But England would take a different course. And this tradition of Anglo-American freedom and the struggle over the divine right of kings will be the focus of our next lecture.